Close to 2 million infected, over 100,000 dead, 5 million out of work in the United States, trillions of dollars of wealth destroyed within the global stock market, all due to a deadly viral pathogen originating from what is known as a wet market. Within this speech, I will educate you on exactly what a wet market is, why they exist today, the problems associated with wet markets, and why I believe they should be banned due to their direct effect on the world in terms of infectious diseases. So let's start with what a wet market is. So fresh food markets have existed forever in different countries, open-air markets, but wet markets are specific to Asian countries. In these places, fish, poultry, snakes, and other animals are slaughtered on site and sold. Sometimes there's more exotic animals, like hedgehogs and rabbits, for sale too. They're called wet markets because they have wet floors from continually melting blocks of ice used to keep the seafood fresh. Also, they spray them down on the ground all the time, so that's where the other meaning for it comes from. So markets are often divided into the wet and dry area, with the dry area being common goods and grains and such, with the wet being actual animals and wildlife. So in order to understand what a wet market is, you need to imagine huge outdoor markets with different live and dead animals, most of which are exotic and non-traditional in terms of what the Western world would consider food. These include like a very wide array of animals, from bats, alligators, camel, fox, ostrich, and many more. The list goes on, and I'm not kidding you. All these different types of animals are normally for sale, or their meats are at least. So researchers of zoonotic diseases that jump from animals to humans, pinpoint the wet markets in China as particularly problematic for several reasons. First, these markets have many different kinds of animals, some wild, some domesticated, but not necessarily native to part of Asia. The stress in these creative markets weakens the animal's immune system and creates an environment where viruses from different species can jump to humans. And this is all courtesy of information from Kevin Olival, a vice president of research at the EcoHealth Alliance. When that happens, a new strain of an animal virus gets a foothold in humans, and an outbreak like the current coronavirus can occur. Oftentimes, cages of live animals are stacked upon one another, and the animals at the bottom of these cages are soaked with all different kinds of liquid, including, but not limited to, animal excrement, pus, blood, or whatever is liquids they're just getting from the top. Then these animals are sold to people shopping in the market, and that's how diseases spread. Obviously very yucky. So this is a quote from author Christine Kreuter-Johnson, director of the Epicenter for Disease Dynamics at the One Health Institute for the UC Davis School of Medicine. And she states, human encroachment into biodiverse areas increases the risk of spillover of novel infectious diseases by enabling new contacts between humans and wildlife. We found that species in the primate and bat orders were significantly more likely to harbor zoonotic viruses compared to all other orders. Obviously, we know that the coronavirus comes from bats, and many of these other diseases come from monkeys. So to understand why wet markets exist, it's important to look in the past and see how we got here. So back in the 1970s, China was undergoing a brutal famine that had claimed the lives of 30 million people. And as a result, local farmers resorted to trapping, raising, catching, eating, and selling these live animals. And because it was sustaining people, the Chinese government actually backed initiatives to protect people engaged in wildlife trade, which kind of led to this birth of a $15 billion cottage industry within China. So animals would be raised in these farms, and out of nowhere, these farms popped up, like small farms. They would be grown in cages and forced to live in very close proximity to each other. Not only that, but there were many different animals that would be breeding, leading for the farms to be a hotbed of diseases for themselves. And then without government oversight, these animals were then transferred to wet markets, either alive or dead, and sold to our end consumers. So, and it's also important to understand that in China, too, they don't necessarily have refrigeration the same way we get it. And a lot of people look at wet markets as a fresh way to get their food because it is being slaughtered there in person. Another reason why you have to also put yourself in a non-traditional sense of thinking, you have to think in China, the wildlife industry is a little more, they're more geared towards holistic medicine. They advertise that a lot of it can do things for your sex life, for your vitality, such like that. So do we have any indication that these wet markets are what causes these diseases? And the answer is a resounding yes. And this was not the first time like an incident like this happened. Let's go back to 2003, where the first outbreak of SARS happened, and it actually was traced to a different wet market in southern China than the corona outbreak that we're currently experiencing. And it reached over 29 countries, killing over 800 people. And at that time, major health experts, lobbyists, and officials were calling for the shutdown of this Chinese wild trade, but they refused, and they shut it down temporarily, but then lifted the bans up again. So in the case of the coronavirus, we actually even know more. So we can trace its origin back to the Hunan wet market in Wuhan, China. And the first 41 patients to test positive for corona in China, 27 of them had actually been to this market. So it probably promptly made the authorities shut down the market, in which they learned that there were 121 different types of animals available for sale at the market, with 75 species being represented. So obviously that's a ton of different animals in a small area. So now that the world sits at a standstill while the death toll rises exponentially, there is no better time than to call now for the banning of wet markets and the subsequent ending of wildlife trade within China. In the past 3 days, Wuhan has recklessly reopened their wet markets, despite calls from all across the globe for them to be outlawed. Action by people's greedy behavior oversees direct negative impact on everyone's life. And I'm not the only one who thinks that. They should do those things right away. Dr. Anthony Fauci, director of National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, and a key member on the White House staff when it comes to corona. It just boggles my mind when we have so many diseases that emanate out of unusual human-animal interference that we just don't shut it down at all. The government in China needs to end such practices for the benefit of the world's greater health. And in doing so, it does need to create a way where people who are losing their jobs from this industry are going to be taken care of, whether that's through farm subsidies or economic help, but that's important so that they don't lose their only sense of livelihood. In conclusion, these wet markets are a breeding ground for disease and infection, which no longer have a place in a world that's so globalized and interconnected as ours. It is on the Chinese government and other Asian nations to assure that such markets never reopen so that we do not have to deal with the senseless tragedy that has been brought by this most recent pandemics. With wet markets opening across China now, it's time to act and make a difference. Thank you.